Well, I don't get a lot of chance to watch TV, much TV, but I have to tell you that I do set aside and DVR the TV show Blue Bloods, which airs on CBS every Friday night at 10 o'clock. And it's a wholesome story about the Frank Reagan, played by Tom Selleck as the police commissioner in New York City with his entire family. There are always three particular incidents that guide what the story is all about, but the denouement of all three of those stories happens at the very end of each show, where Frank and his kids are around the table, and they either get into arguments over something that happened in the course of the day, or they laugh about something, but it's always within the context of faith, and their Catholic faith. And Blue Bloods just finished up its 10th season, and the denouement is to invite and encourage and get people curious about, well, how's the next season going to begin? Well, I share that particular element of Blue Bloods because today, as we gather together to celebrate the Eucharist, we find an end coming to first the Acts of the Apostles. If you want to check me out, open up you find the 28th chapter of the Acts of the Apostles. It concludes on the words that Locke has read this morning. And we also find the very last words written by the gospel writer and the Apostle John. But it's an interesting story. What we have here is not like what happens at the end of Blue Bloods. We finished up a season, now let's move on. And it's not like reading a good book. Well, we've just over the course of this Easter season really read at our masses excerpts from the Acts of the Apostles, and since Holy Week and a good part of Lent and all of the Easter season, we've been reading excerpts from the Gospel of John. This isn't like putting the book on the shelf and then referring it to friends about, you got to read this one because it's pretty good. We really today are celebrating once again what it means that the Word is alive. And both Paul and John help us to focus to see there is no end to the story. It keeps on going because God is eternal. And clearly Paul knew what that meant, because in all the ups and downs of his life, and we hear it now in the closing lines of what Luke had to say about him, Paul wasn't going to stop talking about Jesus, whether it was to the prisoner with whom he was living in Rome, or the Jews who were protesting that he should in fact be condemned to death. Paul was not going to shut up. He knew what the story was all about, and the story was relationship with Jesus. And isn't that the point of this last scene in John 21? I mean, take a look at Peter, that interesting personality, our ancestor in the faith. Jesus and Peter were just finished being reconciled. Peter, now confronted with his 3 times denial of the Lord, is now able to reaffirm his love for the Lord. And what happens after that? He slips into his jealousy. What about him? What about John? What about the beloved disciple? What about him who placed his head on your chest at the Last Supper? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus pauses in a very powerful way and said, that's really not a concern of yours. What should be a concern about you is us. Focus attention on the relationship between you and me. And I think, sisters and brothers, that's a good lesson for us to learn. I have to tell you that, the way that I view my role as the Bishop of Pittsburgh is like a dad. And I have to be honest with you to tell you that I worry about you. You're my kids. If you are members of the faithful of the Church of Pittsburgh, or if you're one of my brother priests or deacons, you got to know I worry about you. And so I find myself, every day worrying about, well, what's happening to our schools? And what's happening to our parishes? What's happening to our priests and our deacons? And what's happening to those who have left the church? And are people understanding we're trying to do good things? And I worry about sometimes when there are headlines and lead stories on the news that make it think like we're dying. And I worry about all of those things. And you got to know that every so often the devil tempts me into thinking that, the real joy is going to happen in my life, one day when I'm not going to have to worry about those things. But it's precisely the devil who's giving me that temptation. Because speaking of TV shows, there's another story, another TV show that's very popular with people. It's called This Is Us. And in a very powerful way, as you and I have a chance to reflect on the readings that we've heard today, the end of the Acts of the Apostles, the end of the Gospel of John, what we are reminded about is that this is not the end of the story. It's not the end of the story of Jesus, because the story really is about us. This is us, each one of us with Jesus. And that, ultimately, and every day, can be the thing that brings us joy. Not to be free from any anxiety that might be yours or mine, but the joy that comes to know that we are never, 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 never alone. The Lord Jesus is with us. Paul knew that, and that's why he couldn't shut up about how Jesus came to save the world. John, who wrote the fourth gospel, knew that because he was best buddies with the Lord. And ultimately, Peter came to know that as well. So just as Jesus invited Peter to remember, pal, it's about us. May you and I remember that as well. And know that then every day, God's grace can help us to have real joy in knowing that He is Emmanuel, God with us.